Hello, I'm David DeCosmo. Welcome to Preview, our public affairs program here on Electric City Television. Today we're joined by Sarah Piccini from the Lackawanna County Historical Society. And Sarah, you have an event coming up that's kind of impressive because it goes way back to some very, very active women here in Lackawanna County, and we're talking about suffrage. I did not realize how much of an effort, how much of an impact women in this area had toward the campaign. So take me back.
Sure.
When did all of the commotion start here in our area?
In our area, it seems that the most recent or the earliest activity that I could find starts around 1912, 1913. There was a woman named Kate Chapman. She's usually identified as Mrs. Maxwell Chapman. Even as these women were fighting for their own rights, they were still identified by their husbands' names every time, which got a little irksome after a while. But Mrs. Maxwell Chapman, Kate Chapman, was the one who kind of spearheaded the suffrage movement in the Scranton area. She founded a branch of the Equal Suffrage League, and they started formally campaigning.
Now, the League was a national organization
It was.
at the time. And I should point out that one of the reasons we've asked you to come and to bring some of the material you have is that the Historical Society is going to actually have an exhibit that will deal with all the efforts specifically in this area towards suffrage. When will that exhibit be presented? Where will it be presented?
The exhibit part of the exhibit is up currently in the Society's headquarters in the Catlin House. We're in the University of Scranton's campus. What we have on exhibit now are some clothing-related items. We had depressingly little in the collection that we could use, but some of the more prominent women that we were able to tell their stories. We started out looking at the span of women in politics, from being political wives in the 1890s with Mrs. Alex Connell. Alex Connell served in Congress from Scranton. She went with him and hosted his dinner parties and whatever in Washington. So we had some beautiful reception gowns of hers. So you have one of those on display. And then moving into early suffragettes and women who moved into politics later.
Now, were these ladies, if I can equate it to a demonstration today, were they marchers? Were they carrying signs in protest of their inability to participate in the electoral system?
In other places they were. We haven't found anything of any overt demonstrations in Scranton. There's a great picture that I found in the Atlantic of a suffrage parade on down Fifth Avenue in New York, and it's a photo of the woman in her white dress carrying the flag, and she looks magnificent, and she knows it. It's the greatest picture. But there's very little actual demonstrations that we found in Scranton. There may have been some that we just haven't come across yet. But they wrote letters. They had meetings at the Century Club and other organizations. They were a little quieter about it. There's stories of Marjorie Scranton, Mrs. Worthington Scranton, went to Harrisburg when she was 16 years old to be part of a protest for suffrage. So they went other places to campaign. In Scranton, we have this photo here. Scranton hosted a statewide convention for suffrage in November of 1914.
This is in front of the old Casey Hotel.
It is.
Just off of the main street, just off of Lackawanna Avenue. And you can see a pretty formidable turnout, considering the fact that, very frankly, these women were challenging a system that had been in place since the beginning of our nation. And I don't know that it was, and you would know more from your research, I don't know if it was a conscious effort to keep females from voting, or was it just something that was assumed that, that they should not?
Yeah. As they were advocating, as they're moving, a lot of the arguments, both for and against suffrage, it's kind of the same argument, just on two different sides. A lot of the suffrage movement was tied into the temperance movement and the beginnings of Prohibition. And the idea that women have a moral imperative, and they would help push the temperance agenda forward. They would vote their consciences. They would vote to support the family and strengthen the family.
Never thought of those two issues being tied, but yet there is some rationale for that. And you'd almost think that they would jump in, as it were, on the temperance movement first, and then almost simultaneously, and perhaps accidentally, get involved in the suffrage movement.
Right. Yeah. It was suffrage in some ways was kind of a way to bring that about. So the suffrage movement in general had its roots back into the 1840s in abolition. Same kind of idea. Let's get equal rights for more people. That the two parties kind of veered after the Civil War to enfranchise black men, and women were okay. We'll wait on you a little bit longer yet. So those two kind of split.
So it wasn't even second place; it was third place.
It was, yeah, yeah.
And how much of an impact did the women in this area have on the overall campaign? I mean, did we have, you mentioned a couple prominent names, so obviously when someone prominent gets involved in a campaign like that, they have more clout.
Sure.
They tend to bring more people on board with them. So were these strong advocates? Did they make a difference?
They did. There is actually... In Pennsylvania, there was a proposed amendment to change the state constitution in 1915 to allow women to vote in Pennsylvania. And the measure passed in Lackawanna County by, I think, almost 70%. That voted for it. It ended up failing statewide. Not everybody was quite as progressive.
And let's remember that males voted for that.
They did. They did. It wasn't only women voting. It was only men voting for this.
Right.
But the women were convincing enough that they convinced more than half of the men in Lackawanna County that women should be allowed to vote.
Well, then obviously the impact was there, and of course they moved on, and as you indicated, some even wound up in political positions.
They did. One of the two that we have in the current exhibit, using Marjorie Scranton again, she had moved from being a suffragette into, she was the chair of the Republican Committee.
And this is the Scranton family?
This is the Scranton family, yes.
City named for them.
Yep. Yep.
Subsequently, in the line of heirs, a governor, a lieutenant governor. A matter of fact, in the case of William Scranton, a presidential candidate at one time, too.
He had an excellent role model. Marjorie was his mother. So, unfortunately, she died about 3 years before he took office as governor. But she was kind of the political foundation. She seems to have been more active politically than her husband, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But she held positions on the state level and on the national level. She campaigned with Wendell Willkie. There's a great picture of her from the Republican National Convention in the 30s with Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Everybody knew who she was. There's an article, an interview with Bill Scranton when he was the governor, calling his mother the Grande Dame, and she absolutely was, I think. So she moved in, but she was the Republican, and then on the Democratic side, the first woman to serve in the state legislature was Marion Munley from Archibald.
Yes.
Her husband passed away in 1947. He was serving as a state representative. She campaigned to fill his seat and ended up winning that election and then 7 subsequent terms after that on her own merits. So she was the first woman in Pennsylvania and the legislature from Lackawanna County. So we've kind of paralleled the two of them together. That she was more maybe officially involved, and Marjorie was kind of always more behind the scenes, but definitely a presence in Republican politics.
There's obviously a limited amount of show and tell available with regard to a movement like this, but I would think that from a recorded point of view, from a published point of view, you would probably have pretty extensive information. Is that correct?
It is. We're relying a lot on newspapers. Because there's, the newspapers covered the debates, listing both sides of the coin. There's a great exchange where an anti-suffragette is complaining, I think around the time of the convention, and she called the suffragettes punks. So we're like...
Now this is a woman who was opposed
yes.
to women...
Opposed to women voting.
And Was that very common, or was it more perhaps women who just didn't take a stand at all?
That I don't know. I was surprised how vehement the arguments get sometimes. And it's a lot of times they are arguing both sides of the coin.
What's the other side of the coin? I mean, I'm obviously asking that from today's perspective of having very active women. I think the voting statistics may show that more registered women voters actually cast their vote than do their male counterparts.
I think you're
One
right.
of our major problems in this area has always been the fact that we tend to have low voter turnouts, and the real shocking thing about that is we're talking about low voter turnouts of registered voters. We don't touch on the fact that there are so many that haven't even bothered to register.
Right.
So that's kind of shocking. So what are the kind of arguments that especially women come out with against women for having the right to vote?
It was the same argument that the temperance women kind of moved forward, that women were voting on a moral side. The argument against that was women had no place in a public sphere. They should stay at home and take care of the husband and the family and have dinner on the table at 6 o'clock or whatever. That it comes out a lot against female politicians today, that women are too emotional. They would vote on a more sentimental theme rather than something based on hard, cold facts. Women were too emotional, too
And
sentimental.
you still do
to
hear
vote.
that as an argument, whether it's rational or
True
not
or
is
not.
another question.
It still comes up. That argument has been around since the 1860s. The movement against women. Women also generally weren't as well educated as men. Upper class women knew a lot about embroidery, maybe, but didn't really understand business or science or how taxes worked or anything like that. That maybe women weren't informed enough or knowledgeable enough to be able to vote, to understand the issues.
I suppose that during that era you had far fewer women that were college educated.
Right.
Although I would think that probably, and I have no statistics to back this, but I would think that more of the women completed a high school education than did the men, because many of them were forced to go to work, perhaps into the mines, perhaps into the iron works and such.
Right. If they weren't working in a silk mill themselves, upper class women, this was still the tail end of the era of the finishing school, where you learned deportment and how to write a nice thank you note. They were important skills to have as the wife of, but they really didn't learn a lot of hard and fast.
So, I mean,
information.
as you say that, there is some sense of validity to some of the arguments opposed
A
to
little
suffrage.
bit. It was up to them to read extensively and read the newspapers. They could certainly be self-educated. But in terms of men going to college and learning business and learning trades and learning these things, women didn't have that formal education. They were more informally educated. So maybe there was a bias to what they were reading, or they knew what they were doing. It just wasn't quite as official. And it was an easier argument to make.
And once again, you come down to a situation where those women supporting suffrage and those women opposing suffrage, their first goal is to convince the man in their life to vote for or against it.
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge there. Yeah, I've already convinced myself, but I need you to go do it for me. Yeah.
Well, this is going to be a great example. Once again, this will be at your headquarters. Is it an ongoing exhibit?
It will. It'll be up. It'll be up through the end of the year, the end of 2020, as this is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. But we'll be having on, I believe it's February 21st. We'll have an exhibit opening on that Friday evening. A little bit of a reception and a curator's talk with some information about what went into the exhibit, kind of an overview of the suffrage movement in general. And what specifically happened in Lackawanna County.
And 100 years isn't that long a time.
It's not.
Not really in the total scheme of humanity. And so when you think that it's only that far back that the right was afforded to the women. And I'm wondering, and I don't know if the records reflect it, how many then took advantage of that right?
I don't know. We have this is the voter roll, or the voter roll from Scranton from 1920. It was the first year that women are listed. And it's done by wards and by address, and there's men and women listed. Whether they actually voted, I don't know.
Well, again, this would have been a registration roll then.
Right.
At least that they took the time to sign up to vote. I would think then, in that era, you would far have been more likely to actually cast a ballot, having gone this far to get involved in the system.
I like to think so. I like to think that the female vote in 1921, the first year, I think they were all excited about it, and I like to think that there were hordes of women at the polls that year.
Yeah, you know, things like this is fall registration 1920, and you think what a treasure something like this is, and people really don't take advantage of some of these things sometimes. You know, we just had a program on a couple of weeks ago about the Knox mine disaster, and I'm thinking to myself, that was in 1959. I myself was just getting involved in broadcasting then.
Okay.
So those, you know, younger than myself, did they have any recollection of what happened, of the tremendous effect it had on our area? Well, similarly, you know, women seeking the right to vote and finally getting it, and what they went through to get it. So an exhibit like this, as limited as you may be into physical things to see, recalls our history. And I mean, I must give the society credit for trying to preserve some of the value of our area. And I know this is not, and we'll touch on this again as to when this is going to be and where people can see some of this and get more information. But what are some of the other things that the society has been involved in and intends to get involved in to really keep our history alive?
We collect anything related to the history of Lackawanna County. So we're running anything from lingerie from the Victorian era to coal mining payroll records from the DL&W. We have volumes of them from 60-some years worth of miners' payrolls. We have everyday items like dolls and toy carriages and a toy cast iron stove. We have military records, letters, and diaries that give a more personal idea of what was going on. One of my favorite things, there's a really great journal. It was kept by a girl who was, I think she was 12 years old, living in Elmhurst. She appointed herself the air raid warden during 1941, and she talks about planting her victory garden and air raid drills, and she was 12 years old. And this was her reality at the time. There are letters from Civil War soldiers. There are volumes of memoirs.
Are these all donations to the society?
They are.
And that probably brings up the thought that you know, if you are watching this, if you're listening to this presentation, you may have a treasure in your home, handed down from your father, from your mother, from your grandfather, your grandmother, that really is taking up space. It's got historical value, but you don't really have the wherewithal to display it yourself. The society, I'm sure, would be glad to have things like this to perpetuate the memories of our area. And what one, you know, I also see there's some, I have your little bio here, and what a great background you have educationally, and also getting involved. According to this, you were the Vanna wife, one of white, for you live here, you should know that. I got involved in that one year, and I was the only guy from Luzerne County on the Lackawanna County. You live here, so mine should have read you live near here. Perhaps you might know about this.
That's fair.
Sort of thing. And of course, you're the assistant director.
I am.
I was interested in this, and I don't know if you're still doing it. Of course, it's seasonal. Scranton After Dark Ghost Tours.
Yes.
And of course, we've done some things here with the dearly beloved players on their presentations at the Dunmore Cemetery. Do you still do that?
We do them in October. Yes, we do them every Friday in October. probably 10 or 12 years ago, the Society worked with a group of paranormal researchers who went into into some of the buildings. The Catlin House was one of them, and did their investigations and recorded things that went bump in the night. So we take people around town and we walk them around and we tell them there's a ghost in there and you should go see it. So there's a little bit of a spooky story, and then we tell them a little bit of the history of the building itself. So you kind of get an idea of why it's haunted, or where the spirits might have come from. So it's a lot of fun.
Have you encountered any?
I haven't personally. Others have. We've had people on the tour taking photos as we go. Some of them swear they've seen glowing orbs around the courthouse. I spent a lot of time in the Catlin House by myself in the dark, so I like to think it's not haunted. But other people think it is.
We are so rich in history in northeastern Pennsylvania. I happen to have, personally, I'm interested in history. I think more people would be if they knew the stories behind some of the things that they can see. I once had a local mayor tell me, and I've looked up ever since. He said, if you want to really get an idea of the history of a community, don't just look at the first floor stores and shops. Look upstairs and see what do you see up there. Some of the ornamentation around our buildings, which makes us attractive to filmmakers from around the world. So these type of efforts to preserve and highlight our history are just, I give you a lot of credit. You also mentioned something's coming up toward Easter time. Would you share that with us?
Sure, we do. We've been doing a Piccini egg making workshop. They're the highly decorated Ukrainian eggs.
Right.
And it's a process of almost wax molding. And then when you dye the egg, the wax is a different color or a different shape that leaves a pattern. There's a woman from St. Cyril and Methodius Parish in Oliphant who's been teaching these classes.
Well, it's a dying art unless you preserve it.
It is. It's a kind of a finicky sort of thing. But when you have the knack for it, they're really, really beautiful keepsakes that you create. She'll do March 24th, I believe. On a Saturday, she'll do 2 sessions at the Catlin House at 10 and at 1 o'clock. She provides all of the materials for them and teaches you step by step how to create them. She also sells her finished pieces if you just want to come buy some. Or we've had people come back who've taken the classes before to just buy supplies, so they can continue doing it once they have the skill themselves.
Is the Society open all the time for those who either want to come in and view an exhibit or perhaps do some research themselves?
We are. We're there on Tuesday to Friday from 10 to 5 and on Saturdays from noon to 3. We get a lot of genealogy researchers. We have a collection of almost 10,000 photographs. We get a lot of people who are looking for specific photos of the grandfather's store or a house where they used to live in or old family houses. We also get a lot of people who are just looking for pictures to put in their offices. They want some old photos of Scranton, of what it looked like back in the day.
Sure.
And we could certainly do that. So we get a lot of researchers. We get tourists coming through who want to know a little bit about the area. People who have just moved to the area sometimes come in. Why do you call it the Electric City? I know the answer to that. So we tell them a little bit about why Scranton is the way it is, and they're like, oh, okay.
Well, again, as I said at the beginning, we have a very rich history in this area, and I think as you learn more about it, you can become appreciative as to just what is here, what was here, and in a sense, what might be here as the future moves along.
Sure.
Right now, however, the center of attention will be the Suffrage Exhibit, which again has already technically started.
It's already up. Yep.
Okay, Sarah. So once again, where and when for that?
It'll be February 21st, about 6 o'clock. It's a Friday evening. We'll do a reception to learn a little bit more about the exhibit. If you're unable to make it that day, I said the exhibit will be up through the end of the year at the Catlin House. The address is 232 Monroe Avenue. We're right in the middle of the university's campus. This suffrage exhibit will be on display. There's a handful of other exhibits throughout the house about coal mining, about railroading, some historic toys and other odds and ends. You get a sense from the house itself what Victorian life was like, just the way the house is laid out. A lot of people walk in and just kind of go, oh. So it's worth it just to come see it. So we hope you could make it and learn a little bit more about Scranton and Lackawanna.
And any particular site or place they can turn for information on current exhibits or future exhibits?
Yep. We have a website. It's lackawannahistory.org. We also have a Facebook page for the Lackawanna Historical Society that we update with upcoming events and programs. We also like to put old photos that we find or neat pieces in the collection of, hey, look what we found. So there's a little bit of a snap exhibits that we put up.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us, talking a little bit about the Suffrage Exhibit and some of the other things that are going on at the Historical Society.
Thank you very much.
Trust we'll see you at the polling places.
Of course you will.
Very good. I'm David DeCosmo for Preview on Electric City Television. Until we see you again next time, here's hoping all your news is good.